Victoria Hayes checked her reflection one final time in the bathroom mirror of her Lincoln Park apartment, her green eyes betraying the nervous energy coursing through her veins. 24 years old, and this was only her third real date since law school graduation. Her fingers smoothed over the navy blue dress she'd chosen specifically for tonight, conservative enough for her professional reputation, but fitted enough to show she had curves beneath all those tailored suits she wore to the firm. Ryan had suggested Bellacourt, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants overlooking the lake. Victoria had Googled the menu 3 times, memorizing prices that made her wince on her junior associate salary. But Ryan was a partner track attorney at a competing firm, the kind of man who moved in circles she aspired to join. When he'd asked her out after the Illinois Bar Association networking event, she'd barely managed to say yes without stuttering. The hostess at Bellacourt examined Victoria with barely concealed judgment, taking in her department store heels and discount jewelry. Reservation name? Hayes. I'm meeting someone. Victoria followed the woman through the dimly lit dining room, past tables where Chicago's elite conducted business over wine that cost more than her monthly student loan payment. The table was perfect, intimate lighting with a view of Navy Pier's distant lights sparkling across the dark water. 7 o'clock came and went. Victoria checked her phone, confirmed the reservation details, and tried to ignore the sympathetic glances from nearby diners. The waiter refilled her water glass with professional courtesy, edged with pity. Would you care for something from the bar while you wait? Just water, thank you. By 7:30, whispers had started at adjacent tables. Victoria caught fragments of conversation. Words like, stood up, and poor thing, floating through the ambient noise of crystal glasses and silverware against fine china. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but years of maintaining composure during hostile depositions served her well. She kept her spine straight, her expression neutral. Her phone buzzed at 7:45. Ryan's text was brief and brutal. Sorry, something came up at work. Rain check? Victoria stared at the screen, reading the message twice before the reality sank in. No apology, no explanation, just casual dismissal as if her evening meant nothing. She'd taken a personal day, spent money she didn't have on this dress, built up courage she rarely possessed for social situations. She gathered her purse with as much dignity as possible, preparing to execute the most graceful exit she could manage. But as she stood, her heel caught on the chair leg. Victoria stumbled forward, her purse flying open and spilling its contents across Bellacourt's polished marble floor. Her phone skittered under the table beside her, followed by her wallet, business cards, breath mints, and the leather portfolio containing notes for tomorrow's client meeting. Papers scattered like confetti, legal briefs mixing with grocery receipts and sticky note reminders. The restaurant's ambient conversation died as every eye in the vicinity turned toward her mortification. Victoria dropped to her knees, scrambling to collect her belongings while fighting back tears of embarrassment. This was worse than being abandoned. This was public humiliation with an audience of Chicago's most influential people. Here, let me help with that. The voice was deep, warm, with an authority that somehow made Victoria's pulse quicken, even in her current state of mortification. Strong hands appeared in her peripheral vision, gathering her scattered papers with surprising care. She looked up to find herself face to face with a man who seemed to command the space around him without effort. He was tall, even crouched beside her, with black hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and blue eyes that held an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something about his presence that drew attention naturally, the way successful people seemed to bend light around themselves. Thank you, Victoria managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm such a disaster. You're not a disaster, he said firmly, handing her the leather portfolio. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, and Victoria felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with embarrassment. You're just having a rough evening. He'd been watching, she realized. This devastating man had witnessed her entire humiliation from beginning to end. The thought should have mortified her further, but something in his expression wasn't pity. It was genuine concern, mixed with something that looked almost like protection. Alessandro Santini, he said, rising to his full impressive height and offering his hand. And you've just survived something that would have sent most people running from this place. Victoria accepted his help standing. acutely aware of the warmth and strength in his grip. Victoria Hayes. And I was about to do exactly that. Run, I mean. Don't. The word was soft but carried absolute conviction. At least not on an empty stomach. Have dinner with me instead. Victoria stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Men who looked like Alessandro Santini, all sharp cheekbones and expensive clothing, didn't rescue clumsy lawyers from public embarrassment, and then invite them to dinner. I don't understand why you'd want to, she said honestly. You don't even know me. What I saw, Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a tone that seemed to wrap around her like velvet, was someone who handled disappointment with more grace than most people manage on their best days. Trust me, I know something about maintaining composure under pressure. The waiter approached with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to unusual situations in exclusive establishments. Mr. Santini, your table is ready whenever you'd like to be seated. Alessandro nodded but didn't take his eyes off Victoria. Would you join me? I promise the conversation will be infinitely better than whatever your original date had planned. Against every rational instinct screaming that this was impossible, Victoria found herself nodding. Okay, but I should warn you. I'm not very good at this. At what? Dating. Talking to people. Any of it, really. The admission tumbled out before she could stop it. Alessandro's expression softened in a way that made something flutter in Victoria's chest. Then we're perfectly matched. Because I haven't been on a real date in longer than I care to admit. He guided her toward a corner table that offered privacy and an even better view of the lake. His hand settled lightly at the small of her back, the touch barely there but somehow burning through the thin fabric of her dress. There was something about Alessandro's presence that made her hyper-aware of every sensation. The new table was set for two with crisp linens and flickering candles. Alessandro pulled out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy that should have felt outdated, but somehow made Victoria feel treasured instead. So, he said once they were seated, tell me about that portfolio you were guarding so carefully. Work or personal project? Victoria felt her eyebrows rise in surprise. Most people asked generic questions about her job or her plans. Nobody ever noticed the details that actually mattered to her. Work, actually. I'm a corporate attorney at Henderson & Associates. That was research for a zoning appeal I'm handling tomorrow. Zoning appeals. Alessandro leaned forward slightly, genuine interest flickering in his blue eyes. Complex area of law. Lots of interested parties involved in those decisions. Something in his tone made Victoria study his face more carefully. You seem to know something about it. Alessandro's smile was enigmatic. I'm in real estate development. You learn quickly that zoning decisions can make or break projects worth millions. Sometimes it's not what you know, but who you know that determines outcomes. That's an interesting way to put it, Victoria said slowly. There was something about the way he'd phrased that, about the knowledge behind his casual comment, that suggested experience with more than standard development processes. In Chicago especially, Alessandro continued, urban development requires creative problem-solving, understanding how to navigate competing interests, resolve conflicts that might arise between various stakeholders. The waiter appeared with wine, something red and undoubtedly expensive that Alessandro must have ordered earlier. He poured with professional efficiency, leaving them alone with their conversation and the soft glow of candlelight. Alessandro raised his glass in a small toast. To salvaging terrible evenings. Victoria lifted her own glass, meeting his eyes across the flickering flame between them. To unexpected kindness from strangers. The wine was smooth, warmer and more complex than anything Victoria typically drank. Around them, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the subtle sounds of Chicago's elite conducting their business. But their corner felt separate from the rest of the world. Can I ask you something? Victoria said, emboldened by wine and genuine curiosity. Anything. Why did you really invite me to dinner? And please don't say it was just kindness. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Would you believe me if I said there was something about you I couldn't walk away from? Heat bloomed in Victoria's cheeks, but she held his gaze. That sounds like a line. It does, he agreed, with a rueful smile. But it's also the truth. Victoria spent the following week researching Alessandro Santini with the same thoroughness she applied to complex legal cases. Her laptop screen glowed in her apartment as she scrolled through limited information about Cooper Holdings, his real estate development company. The man had transformed several neighborhoods along Chicago's waterfront, but the articles were frustratingly vague about his methods and connections. "You're obsessing," Carmen Rodriguez observed, settling into the chair across from Victoria's desk at Henderson & Associates. Her best friend since law school carried 2 coffee cups and wore the expression of someone preparing for an intervention. "I'm not obsessing, I'm being thorough. You've been distracted all week. Partners are starting to notice." Carmen set down Victoria's usual latte and studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing. "This is about Mystery Man from Bellecourt, isn't it?" Victoria couldn't deny it. Alessandro had occupied her thoughts constantly since their dinner, replaying every conversation, every look that had passed between them. He'd been the perfect gentleman, walking her to her car, kissing her hand in a gesture that should have felt outdated, but left her pulse racing instead. "His name is Alessandro Santini. He's in real estate development. And loaded, from what you've told me." Carmen's expression grew concerned. "Vicky, men like that don't usually rescue junior associates from public embarrassment out of the goodness of their hearts. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means powerful men always have agendas. Be careful." Victoria wanted to argue, but something nagged at her about how little concrete information existed about Alessandro online. For someone supposedly worth millions, his digital footprint was remarkably controlled. That afternoon, Victoria found herself at Grind Coffee, her usual spot for reviewing case files outside the office atmosphere. She'd been coming here twice weekly for months, always claiming the same corner table where she could spread out documents without interruption. "Is this seat taken?" Victoria's heart stopped. Alessandro stood beside her table, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary. He looked different in daylight, somehow more real and more devastating simultaneously. "Alessandro," she breathed, acutely aware of her casual jeans and oversized sweater. "What are you doing here?" "Getting coffee," he said with a slight smile, indicating his cup. "Same as you, I assume." "Mind if I sit? The place is packed." Victoria glanced around the half-empty cafe, noting several available tables. Alessandro's eyes followed hers, and his smile widened into something more genuine. "All right, full disclosure. I was hoping I'd run into you. My office is nearby, and when I saw you through the window..." He managed to look both confident and slightly uncertain. "I thought maybe we could continue our conversation from last week." The admission sent warmth spiraling through Victoria's chest. She gestured to the empty chair, trying to ignore how several other patrons had begun staring at their table. "Please, sit. Though I should warn you, I'm not nearly as interesting in broad daylight as I was by candlelight." Alessandro settled into the chair with fluid grace. "I'll be the judge of that." His gaze fell to her laptop screen displaying contract revisions. "What are you working on today?" "Corporate merger documentation. Thrilling stuff," Victoria said dryly. "Nothing as exciting as real estate development. You'd be surprised how much paperwork my business involves. Permits, zoning applications, contractor negotiations." Alessandro paused as his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Victoria caught a flash of something harder in his expression before he declined the call. "Sorry about that. Important business?" "Nothing that can't wait." But Alessandro's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tell me about this merger you're handling." Victoria found herself explaining the complexities of corporate consolidation, while Alessandro listened with genuine attention. His questions were intelligent, probing deeper into regulatory challenges and liability issues with understanding that surprised her. "You seem to know quite a bit about navigating regulatory frameworks," Victoria observed. "Chicago business requires understanding how various agencies interact. Sometimes solutions aren't found in standard procedures." Alessandro's tone carried subtle implications that made Victoria study his face more carefully. His phone buzzed again. This time Alessandro answered with a curt, "What is it?" before switching to rapid Italian that Victoria couldn't follow. His voice carried authority that seemed to fill the space around them, and she caught glimpses of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Scusi," he said, ending the call and returning his attention to her with visible effort to soften his demeanor. "Business complications. Everything all right?" "Nothing I can't handle." Alessandro's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Where were we? They talked for another hour, conversation flowing between professional topics and more personal territory. Alessandro was charming, attentive, asking questions that suggested genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. But Victoria noticed patterns. The way he deflected certain questions about his background, how his phone continued buzzing with calls he either ignored or answered in languages she didn't recognize. When Alessandro excused himself to take another call, stepping outside onto the sidewalk, Victoria watched through the window as his entire posture changed. Gone was the charming dinner companion. In his place stood someone who commanded with quiet menace, gesturing emphatically while speaking into his phone. "Problem?" Victoria asked when he returned, settling back into his chair with visible tension still radiating from his shoulders. "Supply chain issues," Alessandro said vaguely. "Construction projects involve coordinating many different specialists." Something about the pause before specialists made Victoria's legal instincts prickle. She'd interviewed enough witnesses to recognize carefully chosen words designed to obscure, rather than illuminate. "Alessandro," she began carefully, "what exactly do you develop? I mean, specifically, mixed-use properties primarily, residential and commercial integration in areas undergoing urban renewal." His answer was smooth, practiced, but somehow unsatisfying. "It's not as glamorous as it sounds. I'm sure it has its challenges. More than you'd imagine." Alessandro's expression grew serious. Sometimes success requires unconventional approaches to problem-solving. Victoria felt that same flutter of unease she'd experienced at Bellacourt, when he'd discussed zoning appeals. Alessandro spoke like someone familiar with systems most people never encountered, comfortable with complexity that went beyond standard business practices. "Victoria," Alessandro said suddenly, his voice dropping to that velvet tone that made her pulse quicken, "would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? At my place this time? I'd like to cook for you." The invitation sent heat coursing through her veins. "You cook? I find it relaxing. Therapeutic, even." His smile was genuine now, warm in ways that made her forget her growing questions about his business. "Say yes." Victoria knew she should be cautious. Carmen's warnings echoed in her mind, mixing with her own observations about Alessandro's carefully controlled information and mysterious phone calls. But there was something magnetic about him, a pull she couldn't resist despite her rational mind cataloging reasons for concern. "What time?" she heard herself ask. Alessandro's smile transformed his entire face, revealing warmth that made Victoria's chest tighten with anticipation she didn't fully understand. 7. "I'll send my driver to pick you up." "That's not necessary. I can drive myself." "I insist." Alessandro's tone brooked no argument, carrying that same authority she'd glimpsed during his phone conversations. "I want to take care of you, Victoria." The simple words sent shivers down Victoria's spine. As Alessandro prepared to leave, gathering his coat with movements that spoke of contained power, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that accepting his invitation would change everything. She was right. Victoria stood outside the glass tower in Chicago's Gold Coast, craning her neck to take in 37 floors of architectural elegance. The building screamed wealth in subtle ways, understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. Alessandro's penthouse occupied the entire top floor, accessible only by private elevator that required a special key card. The elevator ride seemed to take forever, giving Victoria time to second-guess her decision. She'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on a black wrap dress that struck a balance between elegant and approachable. Her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a woman trying too hard to appear calm. Alessandro opened the door before she could knock, devastating in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt rolled to his elbows. The casual attire somehow made him more attractive, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the polished businessman facade. "Victoria," he said warmly, stepping aside to let her enter. "You look beautiful." The penthouse was a study in controlled luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. The decor was masculine but refined. Leather furniture in rich browns, artwork that looked original and expensive, shelves lined with books in multiple languages. "This is incredible," Victoria breathed, moving toward the windows where Chicago's skyline glittered below them. I'm glad you like it. Alessandro appeared beside her with 2 glasses of wine. It took me years to find exactly what I wanted. Victoria accepted the wine, hyper-aware of how his fingers brushed hers during the exchange. How long have you lived here? 5 years. I had it completely renovated when I bought it. The previous owner had different tastes. Something in his tone made Victoria glance at him curiously. But Alessandro was already moving toward the kitchen, an open space that flowed seamlessly into the living area. I hope you're hungry. I'm making osso buco, my grandmother's recipe. Victoria watched him move around the kitchen with surprising competence, rolling up his sleeves further to reveal forearms corded with muscle. There was something mesmerizing about seeing this powerful man engaged in such a domestic task. Your grandmother taught you to cook? She insisted all her grandsons learn. Said we needed to be self-sufficient. Alessandro's expression grew tender. She was a formidable woman, ran the family with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. She sounds wonderful. She was. Alessandro paused in his stirring, something shadowing his features. She understood that sometimes strength requires flexibility in approach. Victoria settled onto a bar stool at the kitchen island, watching Alessandro work while sipping wine that probably cost more than she spent on groceries in a month. The domestic scene felt surprisingly intimate, as if she were glimpsing a side of him few people ever saw. Tell me about your family, Alessandro said, adding herbs to the simmering pot with practiced precision. Not much to tell. Only child. Parents divorced when I was 12. My mother's a high school teacher in Michigan. My father remarried and moved to California. Victoria traced the rim of her wine glass. We're not particularly close. That must have been difficult. It was. I learned to rely on myself pretty early. Victoria studied Alessandro's profile as he cooked. What about you? Any siblings? 2 younger brothers, both involved in the family business. Alessandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We're very close-knit. Victoria caught the pause, filing it away with her growing collection of carefully chosen words and strategic omissions. As a lawyer, she was trained to notice when people weren't telling complete truths. Alessandro's phone rang, the sound cutting through their comfortable conversation like a blade. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted. The charming dinner companion replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. Excuse me for just a moment, he said, stepping into an adjoining room but leaving the door slightly ajar. Victoria couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation conducted in rapid Italian. Alessandro's voice carried authority and barely contained anger, his tone one of command rather than request. She caught repeated references to territorio and rispetto, territory and respect, words that made her legal instincts prickle with unease. When Alessandro returned, he'd composed himself, but Victoria could see tension radiating from his shoulders. Everything all right? Business complication. Nothing that can't be handled. Alessandro resumed cooking, but his movements were more controlled now, precisely managed. Where were we? Victoria wandered around the living area while Alessandro finished preparing dinner, noting details that painted a picture of the man who lived here. Books on negotiation tactics and conflict resolution filled one shelf, their spines worn from frequent use. Another section contained volumes on urban development and zoning law, but also texts on psychology and what appeared to be military strategy. A photograph on the bookshelf caught her attention. Alessandro in an expensive suit standing beside a man she recognized from Chicago Tribune political coverage. Both men wore expressions of satisfied accomplishment, like they'd just concluded successful negotiations. You know Alderman Morrison? Victoria asked, indicating the photo. Alessandro glanced up from his cooking. We've worked together on several development projects. Chicago politics and real estate are closely connected. I've heard he's being investigated for taking bribes from developers. Rumors and investigations are different things, Alessandro replied carefully. In this city, successful businessmen often face scrutiny simply because they know how to get things done. Victoria felt that familiar flutter of unease. Alessandro spoke like someone comfortable navigating systems most people never encountered. Someone who understood power structures from the inside. Dinner was exquisite. The kind of meal that belonged in Michelin-starred restaurants rather than private homes. Alessandro had created an intimate setting on the terrace, Chicago's lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. The conversation flowed between personal topics and professional observations, But Victoria noticed how Alessandro consistently deflected questions about his specific business practices. "You're very evasive for someone trying to impress a woman," Victoria observed over dessert, wine making her bolder than usual. Alessandro's smile was enigmatic. Some topics require careful handling, such as the kind of negotiations that keep projects moving forward when bureaucracy threatens to derail them. Alessandro's voice carried implications that made Victoria lean forward despite herself. Chicago is a city where knowing the right people can make the difference between success and failure. And you know the right people? I make it my business to understand how systems work. Alessandro reached across the table to cover her hand with his. Sometimes conventional approaches aren't sufficient for unconventional problems. Victoria felt heat shoot up her arm from his touch, but her legal training kept her focused on what he wasn't saying. "That sounds like you work in gray areas." Alessandro's grip tightened slightly. Success often requires operating in spaces where black and white definitions become impractical. "Alessandro," Victoria began, but he was already rising from his chair, moving around the table with predatory grace. "Enough business talk," he murmured, pulling her to her feet and drawing her against his chest. "I've been thinking about this all week." His mouth claimed hers before she could respond, kissing her with hunger that stole her breath. Victoria melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with intensity that surprised them both. Alessandro's hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss until she felt dizzy with want. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alessandro rested his forehead against hers. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion and desire, "there are things about my life, my work, that most people wouldn't understand." "Then help me understand," Victoria whispered, still caught up in the heat building between them. Alessandro's expression grew conflicted, desire warring with something that looked like caution. "Some knowledge comes with consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Instead of answering, Alessandro kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands roaming over her body with possessive intensity that made Victoria's knees weak. But when she pulled back, searching his eyes for honesty, she saw walls coming up. "I should go," Victoria said reluctantly, recognizing that pushing for answers now would only make him retreat further. Alessandro looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he nodded. "I'll have Vincent drive you home." As if summoned, a man appeared from somewhere in the penthouse, tall, broad-shouldered, with the alert posture of professional security. Vincent had been there all along, Victoria realized, watching and protecting even during their intimate dinner. In the elevator descending to the parking garage, Victoria's mind raced with questions about the man who cooked her dinner, while armed security monitored his home, who spoke of business and code and kept books on psychological warfare, alongside Italian cookbooks. She was falling for him despite every rational warning her legal training provided, and that terrified her more than any secret he might be hiding. Victoria barely slept, her mind churning with questions about Alessandro's evasive answers and the armed security in his penthouse. By 3 a.m., she gave up on rest and opened her laptop, applying her legal research skills to the man who had cooked her dinner with such tender precision. What she found made her blood run cold. Cooper Holdings was legitimate, but Victoria's access to legal databases revealed patterns that prosecutors would recognize immediately. The company's projects consistently involved properties where previous owners had faced sudden financial difficulties or mysterious accidents that forced quick sales. Building permits that normally took months were approved in weeks. Zoning variances that should have been impossible sailed through city council meetings. Victoria cross-referenced dates with Chicago Tribune archives, finding articles about construction union disputes that ended abruptly when Cooper Holdings became involved. Workers who had filed safety complaints suddenly withdrew their cases. Environmental violations disappeared from public records after initial filings. The pattern was unmistakable to someone trained in criminal law. Systematic corruption and intimidation disguised as successful business practices. Alessandro didn't just know how systems worked. He controlled them through fear and financial pressure. Her hands trembled as she found the final piece of evidence buried in archived court filings from 3 years ago. A federal investigation into organized crime activities at Chicago's shipping docks had been abruptly terminated when key witnesses disappeared. The lead prosecutor had been reassigned to tax fraud cases. the judge who had signed search warrants for dock properties owned by Cooper Holdings, had suddenly retired to Florida. Alessandro Santini wasn't just a successful real estate developer. He was exactly what her grandmother would have called connected. A modern-day crime boss hiding behind legitimate business facades. Victoria stared at her laptop screen as dawn broke over Lincoln Park, watching evidence accumulate that the man she was falling for controlled Chicago's waterfront through violence and corruption. As a lawyer, she understood the implications better than most civilians would. Association with organized crime could destroy her career, her reputation, her entire future. At 7 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Alessandro. "Good morning, beautiful. I hope you slept better than I did." Victoria's heart clenched at his casual endearment, knowing what she now knew about the hands that had caressed her so tenderly the night before. By 8:30, she was standing outside Alessandro's building again, her entire body vibrating with nervous energy and righteous anger. She dressed in her most professional suit, armor for the confrontation ahead. Alessandro answered his door in pajama pants and a rumpled t-shirt, hair mussed from sleep. His face lit up when he saw her before registering her rigid posture and cold expression. "Victoria? What's wrong? We need to talk." She pushed past him into the penthouse, her heels clicking against marble floors with staccato authority. "About Cooper Holdings. About the dock properties. About who you really are." Alessandro went very still, and Victoria watched his entire demeanor transform. Gone was the charming dinner companion. In his place stood someone who radiated controlled danger. "What exactly do you think you've discovered?" His voice was quiet, measured, but carried undertones that made Victoria's skin prickle with awareness of potential threat. "I know about the witnesses who disappeared during the federal investigation. I know about Judge Henley's sudden retirement. I know about the building permits that get approved in record time and the union disputes that mysteriously resolve in your favor." Victoria's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her legal training overriding fear. "You're not a real estate developer, Alessandro. You're a criminal who uses legitimate business as a front." Alessandro studied her face with intensity that seemed to strip away every defense she'd ever built. After a long moment that stretched between them like a chasm, he nodded slowly. "You're right." The simple admission hit Victoria like a physical blow. Part of her had hoped she was wrong, that there was some explanation that would preserve the fairy tale of the last 2 weeks. "I control shipping operations at 3 major docks," Alessandro continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute honesty. "My family has business interests throughout Chicago: construction, waste management, several restaurants and nightclubs. Some of our activities fall outside traditional legal boundaries. Your family?" Victoria's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "The Santini family has operated in Chicago for 4 generations. We provide services that legitimate businesses can't or won't handle. We resolve disputes that courts can't settle efficiently. We ensure that projects important to the city's economic health move forward regardless of bureaucratic obstacles." Victoria sank onto his leather sofa, her legs suddenly unsteady. "You're talking about extortion, about intimidation and bribery and possibly murder." Alessandro's expression didn't change. "I'm talking about reality, about how power actually works in cities like Chicago. The difference between successful people and everyone else isn't morality. It's willingness to do what's necessary." "What's necessary?" Victoria stood again, pacing to the windows overlooking the lake. "Alessandro, I'm a lawyer. I took an oath to uphold the law. Everything you're describing is exactly what I spent 7 years in school learning to prosecute. I know what you are, Victoria. I knew it when I invited you to dinner at Bellacourt, and I knew it when I cooked for you last night." Alessandro moved closer, but stopped when Victoria held up a hand. "I also know that you're intelligent enough to understand that the law and justice aren't always the same thing. Don't." Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "Don't try to justify this. Don't try to make me complicit in criminal activity by explaining your philosophy." Alessandro's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking you to be complicit in anything. I'm telling you who I am because you deserve honesty." "Honesty?" Victoria laughed bitterly. 2 weeks of lies followed by 1 morning of truth isn't honesty, Alessandro. It's damage control. Everything I've told you about myself has been true. My feelings for you, my grandmother's recipes, my books, the way I feel when you're in my arms. None of that was deception. Alessandro's voice grew rough with emotion. The only thing I haven't shared is the nature of my work. Victoria felt tears threatening and fought them back with professional composure. The nature of your work is criminal activity. It's violence and corruption and everything I've dedicated my career to fighting. Then fight me, Alessandro said quietly. Turn me in. Use whatever evidence you've found to destroy me. But know that it won't change how I feel about you. The words hung between them like a challenge and a plea simultaneously. Victoria stared at the man she'd been falling in love with, seeing him clearly for the first time. Alessandro Santini was dangerous, powerful, and completely outside the boundaries of everything she'd built her life around. I can't do this, Victoria whispered, backing toward the door. I can't be with someone whose livelihood depends on destroying other people's lives. Alessandro didn't try to stop her as she fled toward the elevator, but his voice followed her. This doesn't change what's between us, Victoria. You can run from me, but you can't run from that. The elevator doors closed on his words, and Victoria collapsed against the mirrored wall, finally allowing tears to fall as she descended toward street level and away from the man who had just shattered her world with brutal honesty. As a lawyer, she knew exactly what Alessandro Santini represented. As a woman, she knew she was already lost to him. Victoria threw herself into work with obsessive determination, taking on extra cases and staying late every night to avoid the silence of her apartment, where thoughts of Alessandro could ambush her. For a week, she managed to maintain the illusion that she could simply erase him from her life through sheer professional focus. Alessandro didn't call. He didn't show up at her office or appear unexpectedly at Greened Coffee. Instead, flowers arrived at her apartment each morning. Not elaborate arrangements that screamed wealth, but single stems with handwritten notes that revealed depths she hadn't expected from a man who controlled Chicago's underworld through fear. Monday brought white roses with a note that simply read, I understand why you ran. I would have done the same. Tuesday's yellow tulips carried the message, your integrity is one of the things I love most about you. Wednesday's single red peony whispered, I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking you to understand. Victoria found herself saving the notes despite her better judgment, reading them during lunch breaks when the weight of pretending everything was normal became unbearable. Alessandro's words revealed vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the dangerous man who had admitted to criminal enterprise without flinching. You look terrible, Carmen observed, settling into Victoria's office with coffee and concerned brown eyes. And don't tell me it's just work stress. I know what work stress looks like on you. And this is something else entirely. Victoria glanced up from the merger documents she'd been staring at without reading for the past hour. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've been distracted, jumpy, and you flinch every time someone mentions real estate development. Carmen leaned forward, lowering her voice. This is about Mystery Millionaire, isn't it? What happened? Victoria wanted to confide in her best friend, but how could she explain that she'd fallen in love with a man whose business practices belonged in federal indictments? We're incompatible. Incompatible how? Different backgrounds? Different values? Carmen's expression grew shrewd. Or different relationships with law enforcement? Victoria's sharp intake of breath confirmed Carmen's suspicions. Her friend had always possessed an uncanny ability to read between lines. Vicky, please tell me you didn't get involved with someone who operates outside legal boundaries. It's complicated. It's always complicated with men like that. Carmen's voice carried frustration and genuine concern. The question is whether he's tax evasion complicated or murder complicated. Victoria couldn't answer, which was answer enough. Carmen sat back in her chair, processing implications with the quick intelligence that had made her an excellent attorney. You need to walk away. Completely. No contact, no exceptions, no romantic justifications about love conquering all. Carmen's tone brooked no argument. Your career, your reputation, your entire future depends on maintaining distance from criminal activity. Victoria knew Carmen was right. Every rational part of her mind agreed with her friend's assessment. But late at night, when Chicago's skyline glittered beyond her windows, she found herself remembering Alessandro's hands in her hair. The way he'd looked at her like she was precious beyond measure, the tenderness with which he'd cooked dinner while armed security protected them both. Thursday afternoon brought unwanted attention from senior partners. Victoria was reviewing contract specifications when James Patterson knocked on her office door, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating delicate professional territory. "Victoria, do you have a moment?" Patterson settled into the chair across from her desk, studying her with the calculating gaze that had made him a formidable litigator. "There's been some discussion about your personal associations recently." Victoria's stomach dropped. "Sir, several people have mentioned seeing you with Alessandro Santini. Given his prominent position in Chicago development circles, some partners have expressed curiosity about the nature of your relationship." The careful phrasing told Victoria everything she needed to know. Henderson and Associates was aware of Alessandro's reputation, even if they couldn't prove specific criminal activities. Her association with him was being evaluated for potential firm liability. "We're not seeing each other anymore," Victoria said carefully. "Good. I'm sure you understand that attorneys must be particularly cautious about appearances of impropriety." Patterson's smile was professionally warm, but carried underlying warning. "Your work here has been exceptional, Victoria. We wouldn't want personal entanglements to complicate your promising career trajectory." After Patterson left, Victoria sat in her office staring at Chicago's afternoon skyline while processing the implications. Alessandro's world was seeping into hers even without direct contact. Simply knowing him, briefly dating him, was enough to trigger professional scrutiny that could derail everything she'd worked to achieve. That evening, Victoria found herself walking along Lake Michigan's shoreline, seeking clarity in the rhythm of waves against stone barriers. The October air carried autumn's bite, matching the cold determination she was trying to cultivate regarding Alessandro. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Navy Pier, East End by the lighthouse, please." Victoria stared at the message, recognizing Alessandro's careful courtesy even in digital form. Every logical instinct screamed that she should delete the text and continue her evening walk. Instead, she found herself turning toward Navy Pier, drawn by magnetic force she couldn't resist. Alessandro stood silhouetted against Lake Michigan's darkening waters, hands shoved deep in coat pockets, shoulders rigid with tension. He looked different somehow, less controlled, more human. When he turned at her approach, Victoria saw exhaustion in his blue eyes that spoke of sleepless nights matching her own. "You came," he said simply. "I shouldn't have, but you did." Alessandro stepped closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "Thank you." Victoria studied his face in the lighthouse beam's intermittent glow. "Alessandro, this has to stop. The flowers, the notes. I can't continue receiving them. I know." His voice carried resignation that somehow hurt more than argument would have. "I wanted to say goodbye properly. And to thank you. Thank me for what? For seeing me. Not just the surface, not just the money or the power, but actually seeing who I am underneath everything else." Alessandro's expression grew tender in ways that made Victoria's chest ache. "For 1 week, I got to be just a man cooking dinner for a woman who made me want to be better than I am." "Alessandro." Victoria's voice caught on his name. "I love you, Victoria." The words were quiet, but carried absolute conviction. "I know that complicates everything, makes it harder for you to walk away cleanly. But I needed you to know before we end this, that what happened between us was real. The most real thing in my life." Victoria felt tears threatening, fought them back with professional composure that was rapidly crumbling. "I love you too. That's what makes this impossible." Alessandro's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected her admission. "Then why are we standing here talking about endings? Because love isn't enough. Because I'm a lawyer who swore to uphold laws you break routinely. Because associating with you professionally destroys everything I've worked to build." Victoria's voice grew stronger even as her heart shattered. "Because I can't be with someone whose success depends on other people's fear and suffering." "I understand." Alessandro nodded slowly, accepting her reasoning without argument. "But understand this. My feelings for you won't change because circumstances are complicated. If you ever need anything at all, you call me. No questions asked, no obligations attached." The simple offer, made without expectation of reciprocation, nearly broke Victoria's resolve entirely. Alessandro Santini was dangerous, criminal, and completely outside every boundary she'd established for her life. He was also the only man who had ever made her feel truly seen, truly valued for her mind as much as her heart. "Goodbye, Alessandro," Victoria whispered, turning away before she could change her mind. This time, she didn't look back. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and forced normalcy had worn Victoria's resolve to its breaking point. She sat in her office, staring at merger documents that seemed to blur together, her mind constantly drifting to Alessandro's words at Navy Pier. The finality of their goodbye should have brought relief, but instead left an aching emptiness that professional achievements couldn't fill. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "There's someone I'd like you to meet. No obligations, just coffee. Please consider it. Amy." Victoria stared at the message, her heart racing at the simple initial. Alessandro was reaching out, but not for himself. The careful phrasing suggested something different. Something that acknowledged their boundaries while leaving room for possibility. Against every rational judgment, she found herself typing, "When and where?" The response came immediately. "Grind coffee. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Ask for Maria." Victoria spent the next 24 hours alternating between canceling plans and showing up early. When she finally entered the familiar cafe, scanning for an unfamiliar woman, she spotted her immediately. Maria Santini possessed the same magnetic presence as her son, but tempered with maternal warmth that made Victoria feel instantly comfortable. "Victoria Hayes," Maria said, rising from the corner booth with elegant grace. She appeared to be in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in understated luxury that spoke of old money and older wisdom. "Thank you for coming. Mrs. Santini." Victoria slid into the opposite seat, studying the woman who had raised Alessandro. "I have to admit, I'm not sure why I'm here. Because my son is miserable, and I believe you might be as well." Maria's directness was softened by genuine concern. "Alessandro told me about your conversation at the pier. He respects your decision, but I wanted to meet the woman who managed to capture his heart so completely." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure what Alessandro told you about us, but he told me you're an attorney with impeccable integrity who challenged him to be better than he thought possible." Maria smiled, transforming her serious features. "He also told me you walked away because you couldn't reconcile loving him with opposing what he represents professionally." The accurate summation left Victoria momentarily speechless. "That's essentially correct." What if I told you there might be another way?" Victoria leaned forward despite herself. "What do you mean?" "The Santini family has been in Chicago for 4 generations. We've survived by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles of loyalty and protection." Maria chose her words carefully. "Alessandro has been working to transition our interests toward more legitimate enterprises. It's a complex process that requires expertise in corporate law and regulatory compliance. You're offering me a job." Victoria couldn't hide her surprise. "I'm suggesting a consultation. Alessandro's vision for the family's future requires someone who understands both the legal framework we need to operate within and the practical realities of our current situation." Maria's expression grew serious. "We're not asking you to compromise your principles, Victoria. We're asking you to help us align our operations with them." Victoria processed the implications. "You're talking about legitimizing criminal enterprises. I'm talking about evolution. About ensuring that the next generation of Santinis operates entirely within legal boundaries while maintaining our ability to provide for those who depend on us." Maria leaned back, allowing Victoria space to think. "It would be challenging work, lucrative work, and it would allow you to be part of solution rather than simply opposing the problem." The offer was tempting in ways Victoria hadn't expected. Using her legal expertise to transform rather than prosecute could satisfy both her professional ambitions and her complicated feelings for Alessandro. "I'd need complete autonomy over legal decisions. No interference, no pressure to bend rules or overlook violations." "Agreed, and I maintain my position at Henderson and Associates. This would be consulting work only." Maria nodded. Alessandro anticipated those conditions. "He said you'd never abandon your principles for anyone, including him. It's one of the reasons he loves you." Victoria's chest tightened at the mention of Alessandro's feelings. "Where is he?" "Giving us space to talk. He said this decision needed to be entirely yours, without pressure from him." Maria smiled again, though I suspect he's wearing a path in his office carpet from pacing. That evening, Victoria found herself standing outside Alessandro's building again, but this time with purpose, rather than confrontation. The doorman recognized her, offering a respectful nod as he directed her to the private elevator. Alessandro opened his penthouse door, looking cautiously hopeful, as if afraid to believe she was actually there. Victoria. Her name was barely a whisper. Your mother made me an interesting proposition. Alessandro stepped aside to let her enter, and Victoria noticed he'd prepared for her visit. Wine breathing on the counter, soft music playing, subtle romantic touches that suggested optimism despite their complicated circumstances. Did she? His tone was carefully neutral, but Victoria caught the tension in his shoulders. She wants me to help legitimize your family's operations, to use my legal expertise to transform your business model rather than simply opposing it. Victoria turned to face him directly. Is that what you want? What I want is you in my life. However that's possible. Alessandro moved closer, stopping just within reach. But I won't ask you to compromise your integrity for my convenience. What if I told you I've been thinking about this wrong? What if instead of seeing your world as something that threatens mine, I viewed it as something that needs mine? Alessandro's eyes widened. Victoria, I love you, she said simply. That doesn't make the situation less complicated, but it makes walking away impossible. So if we're going to be together, we're going to do it right. Alessandro closed the distance between them, cupping her face with hands that trembled slightly. Are you sure? Once you're part of this world, there's no going back to simple. I stopped believing in simple the night you rescued me at Bellecourt. Victoria rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring weeks of longing and decision into the connection between them. Besides, I've never been interested in easy cases. Alessandro's response was immediate and overwhelming, his arms crushing her against his chest as he kissed her with desperate hunger. Victoria melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as months of suppressed desire exploded between them. I love you, Alessandro murmured against her lips. I love your mind, your strength, your stubborn integrity that won't let me take shortcuts. Show me, Victoria whispered, and Alessandro swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the bedroom with sure purpose. Later, as they lay entwined in Alessandro's bed, Chicago's lights twinkling beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, Victoria traced patterns on his chest while processing the magnitude of her decision. Carmen's going to kill me when she finds out, Victoria murmured. Alessandro's chuckle rumbled beneath her ear. I'll make sure you have excellent security. This is going to be complicated. The best things usually are. Alessandro tightened his arms around her. But we'll figure it out together. Victoria lifted her head to meet his gaze, seeing her future reflected in blue eyes that held both danger and devotion in equal measure. She'd chosen love over safety, complexity over simplicity, and for the first time since that night at Bellecourt, she felt completely at peace with her decision. 1 month into their renewed relationship, Victoria had established a routine that balanced her legitimate career with consulting work for the Santini family's legal restructuring. Her mornings belonged to Henderson and Associates, afternoons to transforming Alessandro's business empire into something that could withstand federal scrutiny. The work was challenging, intellectually stimulating, and surprisingly fulfilling. She was reviewing incorporation documents in Alessandro's penthouse office when Vincent appeared in the doorway, his expression grimmer than usual. Boss, we have a problem. Tommy Ricci's been asking questions about Victoria around the neighborhood, specifically about her schedule and where she lives. Alessandro's jaw tightened dangerously. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's planning to use her as leverage. Victoria looked up from her legal briefs, ice forming in her stomach. Who's Tommy Ricci? Small-time operator trying to expand his territory into ours, Alessandro explained, his voice carrying controlled fury. He lacks the intelligence for direct confrontation, so he targets vulnerabilities, meaning me, meaning he's about to make the last mistake of his miserable life. Alessandro stood, pacing to the windows with predatory energy. Vincent, double security on Victoria's apartment and office building. I want eyes on her every moment she's not here. Victoria felt claustrophobic suddenly, the weight of Alessandro's world closing around her like a trap. Alessandro, I can't live like this. I can't have armed guards following me to court hearings and client meetings. Before Alessandro could respond, Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Victoria Hayes. Her professional voice masked growing unease. Ms. Hayes, this is Detective Sarah Mitchell, Chicago PD. I'd like to speak with you about your relationship with Alessandro Santini. Can you meet me for coffee this afternoon? Victoria's eyes met Alessandro's across the room, seeing his expression darken as he read her face. I'm sorry, Detective, but I don't discuss my personal relationships with law enforcement without my attorney present. This isn't about your relationship, Ms. Hayes. It's about your safety. Tommy Ricci has been making inquiries about you. We believe he intends to use you against Mr. Santini. And frankly, you're in danger. Victoria's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of danger? The kind that ends with innocent people getting hurt because they're connected to the wrong person. Meet me at Millennium Park near the Bean. In 2 hours. Come alone. The line went dead. Victoria stared at her phone, while Alessandro crossed the room with swift purpose. What did she want? To warn me about Tommy Ricci, and probably to recruit me as an informant. Victoria met Alessandro's gaze steadily. She wants to meet in 2 hours. Absolutely not. Alessandro's tone brooked no argument. It's too dangerous. Ricci could be watching police movements, planning to intercept you, or it could be my chance to find out exactly what we're dealing with. Victoria stood, moving toward him with determination that matched his own. Alessandro, I'm not some helpless civilian who needs protection. I'm a lawyer who knows how to handle law enforcement and gather information. You're the woman I love, and I won't risk losing you to prove a point about independence. The raw emotion in his voice stopped Victoria's argument. She reached up to cup his face, feeling tension radiate through his jaw muscles. Then come with me. Not obviously, but close enough to intervene if necessary. Victoria's voice grew stronger as a plan formed. We use this meeting to our advantage. I find out what evidence the police have, what they know about Ricci's plans, and we stay ahead of both threats. Alessandro studied her face for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Vincent positions teams around the park. You wear a wire so we can monitor the conversation. And at the first sign of trouble, you get out. 2 hours later, Victoria sat on a bench near Millennium Park's iconic sculpture, hyper-aware of the nearly invisible surveillance teams Alessandro had positioned throughout the area. Detective Mitchell appeared precisely on time, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous work. Ms. Hayes, thank you for coming. Detective Mitchell. Victoria gestured to the bench beside her. You mentioned Tommy Ricci. Mitchell settled beside her, scanning the surrounding area with professional awareness. Ricci's been gathering information about you for the past week. Your address, your work schedule, your relationship with Santini. We believe he's planning to kidnap you to pressure Santini into surrendering territory. Victoria felt cold despite the afternoon sunshine. Do you have evidence of this plan? Enough to know you're in immediate danger, which is why I'm here. Mitchell turned to face her directly. We can protect you, Ms. Hayes. Full witness protection, new identity, relocation to anywhere in the country. All you have to do is cooperate with our investigation into Santini's operations. And if I refuse, then you're on your own against men who consider violence a standard business practice. Mitchell's expression grew sympathetic. I understand this is difficult. You care about Santini, and he's probably been good to you personally, but he's a criminal, Ms. Hayes. Eventually, that world will destroy everything you've built. Victoria processed the offer while remembering Alessandro's words about choosing between safety and love. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? Financial records, meeting locations, names of associates, details about legitimate businesses used to launder money. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. You've been consulting on legal restructuring for his organization. You have access to exactly the information we need to dismantle his operation. In exchange for my safety, in exchange for doing the right thing. Victoria stood, decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Detective Mitchell, I appreciate your concern for my well-being, but I won't betray someone I love to save myself from consequences of my own choices. Mitchell's expression hardened. Ms. Hayes, you're making a serious mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make. That evening, Victoria sat in Alessandro's living room, while he processed information she'd gathered from her conversation with Detective Mitchell. His expression grew grimmer as she relayed details about the police investigation's scope and Ricci's specific plans. "They have more than I realized," Alessandro admitted. "Financial trails we thought were secure, surveillance footage from legitimate business meetings. Mitchell wasn't bluffing about having enough evidence to cause problems. What about Ricci? Vincent's already handling that situation. By tomorrow morning, Tommy Ricci will be explaining to federal authorities why his warehouse contains stolen electronics and unlicensed firearms." Alessandro's smile was coldly satisfied. "Sometimes the best way to neutralize a threat is to let legitimate law enforcement do their job." Victoria stared at him. "You set him up. I provided information about his actual criminal activities to appropriate authorities. Completely legal, entirely ethical." Alessandro moved to kneel beside her chair. "The difference between successful people and everyone else isn't morality, Victoria. It's strategy. And Detective Mitchell? We'll find her investigation significantly more complicated when her primary witness against me disappears into federal prison." Alessandro took Victoria's hands in his expression growing serious. "You chose to warn me instead of cooperating with police. You chose my world over your safety. I chose you. Then be my queen." Alessandro reached into his jacket, producing a ring that took Victoria's breath away. The diamond was flawless, set in platinum with a design that managed to be both elegant and bold. "Marry me, Victoria. Not despite the complications, but because of them. Because we're stronger together than either of us could be alone." Victoria stared at the ring, processing the magnitude of what Alessandro was asking. Marriage to him meant permanent entry into his world, complete abandonment of the safe, predictable life she'd built. It also meant partnership with a man who valued her intelligence, respected her principles, and loved her enough to let her choose danger over protection. "Yes," she whispered, and Alessandro slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. As he kissed her, Victoria realized she'd stopped running from the complications of loving Alessandro Santini. Now she was ready to face them as his equal. 3 months had transformed Victoria's life in ways she never could have imagined. The woman who had once been abandoned at Bellacourt now sat in the private office of Carmichael and Associates, a boutique law firm that specialized in representing clients who valued discretion above all else. Her corner office overlooked Lake Michigan, decorated with law degrees that now served a very different clientele than she'd originally intended. Alessandro had been right about strategy trumping morality in certain circles. Her transition from Henderson and Associates had been smooth, facilitated by glowing recommendations and a client list that followed her to the new firm. The senior partners at Carmichael understood exactly what kind of legal services Victoria provided, and they compensated her accordingly. The morning sun streamed through her office windows as Victoria reviewed the final incorporation documents for Santini Holdings' latest legitimate venture, a renewable energy development company that would provide clean alternatives to Chicago's industrial district. Every contract was meticulously legal, every regulatory filing beyond reproach. Alessandro's transformation from crime boss to legitimate businessman was nearly complete, thanks to her expertise in corporate law and his willingness to evolve. Her engagement ring caught the light as she signed documents, the diamond serving as a constant reminder of the choice she'd made to embrace complexity rather than flee from it. In 2 hours, she would become Mrs. Alessandro Santini, in a ceremony that perfectly represented their unique circumstances. Intimate enough to honor their love, grand enough to announce their union to Chicago's power brokers. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Getting ready to watch my best friend marry a reformed criminal. Still think you're crazy. Still love you anyway." Their friendship had survived Victoria's dramatic life change, though it had required honest conversations and careful boundaries. Carmen had eventually accepted that Victoria had made an informed choice with full understanding of the consequences. The fact that Alessandro genuinely seemed to be legitimizing his operations had helped Carmen reconcile herself to the situation. A knock on her office door interrupted Victoria's review of the morning's documents. Alessandro entered without waiting for permission, devastatingly handsome in his wedding suit, charcoal gray Italian wool that had been tailored to his impressive frame with surgical precision. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony," Victoria protested, though her heart raced at his presence. Traditional rules don't apply to people like us, Alessandro replied, crossing the office to pull her into his arms. Besides, I have something for you. He produced a small velvet box that contained earrings to match her engagement ring, diamond teardrops that would complete her bridal ensemble perfectly. As Alessandro fastened them with gentle precision, Victoria caught their reflection in the office windows and marveled at how natural they looked together. Ready to become my wife officially? Alessandro murmured against her ear. I've been ready since the night you cooked dinner for me. The ceremony took place in the garden of Maria Santini's estate, surrounded by family members who had welcomed Victoria with genuine warmth once they understood her role in Alessandro's transformation. Maria had tears in her eyes as she watched her son pledge his life to the woman who had challenged him to become better than he thought possible. Father Michael, who had baptized Alessandro 32 years ago, performed the ceremony with traditional Catholic elegance. Victoria had converted not out of obligation, but because Alessandro's faith was an integral part of who he was, and she wanted to understand every aspect of the man she was marrying. You may kiss your bride, Father Michael announced, and Alessandro didn't hesitate to claim her mouth with passion that drew cheers from their assembled guests. The reception showcased the best of both their worlds. Victoria's law school friends mingling with Alessandro's business associates, legitimate entrepreneurs sharing tables with reformed criminals who had followed Alessandro's example in transitioning their operations toward legal enterprises. Carmen gave a toast that managed to be both heartfelt and subtly threatening. To Victoria and Alessandro, may your love be modern, your marriage traditional, and Alessandro's continued commitment to legal business practices absolute. Alessandro's response was equally diplomatic. To Victoria, who saw past what I was to what I could become, and loved me enough to help me get there. As they danced their first dance to Sinatra's The Way You Look Tonight, Victoria felt the weight of curious gazes from Chicago's elite. She was no longer the junior associate who had been stood up at an expensive restaurant. She was Alessandro Santini's wife, a woman who commanded respect through her own accomplishments and her husband's devotion. 2 weeks into their honeymoon in Tuscany, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She stared at the test results in their villa's marble bathroom, processing the magnitude of what this meant for their complicated life. When she emerged to find Alessandro reading on the terrace overlooking rolling vineyards, her expression must have revealed everything. Victoria? Alessandro rose immediately, crossing to her with concern written across his features. What's wrong? I'm pregnant. Alessandro's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, fierce protectiveness, and finally overwhelming tenderness. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around while tears tracked down his cheeks. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. Are you happy? Victoria asked, suddenly uncertain about how pregnancy would complicate their already complex circumstances. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Alessandro set her down carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. You're carrying our child, Victoria. You're giving me a family I never thought I deserved. That evening, as they sat on the terrace sharing wine, sparkling cider for Victoria, and discussing baby names, Alessandro grew serious. Our child will grow up in a different world than I did, he said quietly. Completely legitimate, completely safe. They'll never know the weight of carrying family secrets or making impossible choices between loyalty and morality. They'll know their father evolved because he loved their mother enough to change. 6 months later, Victoria stood in Bellacourt's private dining room, her pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her flowing dress. Alessandro had purchased the restaurant where they'd met, transforming it into the crown jewel of his legitimate hospitality empire. Tonight, they were hosting the grand reopening, attended by the same Chicago elite who had witnessed her humiliation that first night. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria, as she watched politicians and business leaders compete for Alessandro's attention, seeking his influence and investment in their projects. The man who had once controlled territory through fear now wielded power through wealth and strategic partnerships. Regrets? Alessandro asked, appearing beside her with champagne for himself and sparkling water for her. Victoria looked around the restaurant where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. Through the windows, Chicago's skyline glittered with the lights of buildings Alessandro had developed, businesses he now owned legitimately, a city where his name commanded respect rather than fear. Only one, Victoria said, placing her hand on her growing belly where their child moved restlessly. I regret that it took being abandoned here to find you. Alessandro's smile was tender as he covered her hand with his. Everything happens for a reason, Mrs. Santini. Even the worst nights can lead to the best futures. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Victoria and Alessandro sat alone at the same corner table, where he had first rescued her from public humiliation. The restaurant was theirs now, like everything else in their carefully constructed empire built on love, legal expertise, and the willingness to transform rather than simply abandon the past. "What are you thinking about?" Alessandro asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About how far we've both come. About the baby. About building something better than either of us could have achieved alone." Victoria reached across the table to take his hand. "About being grateful for second chances." Alessandro lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "To the woman who saved me from myself, and the life we're building together." Outside, Chicago pulsed with energy and ambition, a city where dreams and nightmares intersected in equal measure. But inside Bellacourt, surrounded by the ghosts of who they used to be and the promise of who they were becoming, Victoria had everything she'd never known she wanted. She was Alessandro Santini's wife, partner, and queen of an empire built on transformation rather than destruction. And she had never been happier.